Great.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. I hope you're all enjoying the start of spring. And today we're so excited to hear from Dr. Kehl on things you really need to know when submitting your NIH grant proposal. So just a few housekeeping items. Attendees are muted and video cannot be turned on, but we still encourage you to engage with us by entering your thoughts in the chat and your questions in the Q&A feature, which is a button at the bottom of your toolbar. And we will address questions at the end of today's presentation. Also on our panel today is Dr. Christine Ritchie, co-chair of the PCRC. So I think I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Ritchie to please formally introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Naomi. And, truth be told, I'm not sure our speaker needs an introduction. I think she is a beloved member of our palliative care community. That being said, I do want to tell you a little bit about Dr. Kehl. She joined the National Institute of Nursing Research in 2014 as a health scientist administrator, and her portfolio includes research on pain, palliative, and end-of-life care. Other research interests that she has include rural populations and research dissemination and implementation. And at NINR, she serves as the program officer or project scientist on several UG3, UH3 pragmatic clinical trials, and the U2C palliative care research cooperative group, which is how we have the good fortune of knowing Dr. Kehl. She's also the program officer for P20 and P30 centers. Dr. Kehl's research background focuses on improving care in the last phase of life. And so in addition to experience teaching at several colleges of nursing, she has experience as a clinical nurse specialist, a clinical nurse educator, and as a hospice clinical director. Dr. Kehl has received research funding from the National Institutes of Health, Oncology Nursing Society, and the Hospice and Palliative Nurses Foundation. She's received multiple awards, including the Outstanding New Investigator Award from the Hospice and Palliative Care Nurses Association, and she serves on the board of directors of HIPNA, or as many of us know, the Hospice Palliative Nurses Association. She's a fellow in palliative care nursing, and she holds BS and PhD degrees in nursing from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Kehl is one of those people who you can always go to get really the most salient and relevant information for research that you're a part of. She always has incredible insights, and you will learn a lot from today. And I just can't tell you enough, Karen, how grateful we are for you and also for your presentation today.
Well, I'm really excited to be here and doing this. I kind of feel like this is bookends. One of the early presentations that we had in a webinar was Lynn Adams and I talking about tips for putting in applications. So this is kind of an updated version with some of the new issues that are going on at NIH. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what happens to your application at NIH. Many of you know this, but it's important and is increasingly becoming important to get your application to the place you want it to go. So when applications come in, all grant applications go to the Division of Receipt and Referral, which is within the Center for Scientific Review. When DRR, the Division of Receipt and Referral, gets the application, a person checks it for completeness, determines the area of research, and determines which specific institute or center to assign it to for possible funding. They do take into account your request, but ultimately they're going to assign the institute that they think is best suited or has shown the most interest in that type of research. They really are making those assignments with your best interest in mind. From the time that the application comes in until it gets assigned to either a review branch or an institute, In addition to going through machine learning programs like the assisted referral tool, which you can use to help choose a study section, it also goes through at a minimum of 5 research scientists. So lots of work that goes into this. Once at that point, it gets signed to a scientific review group or a review committee that has the appropriate expertise, as well as to an institute or center. From the scientific review side, you'll be assigned to a scientific review officer, and at the IC, they'll assign a program officer. Now, you may have noticed, and occasionally it happens, that an application will be assigned to an institute, and then you'll go back a few days and it's assigned someplace else. Because the institutes also have referral liaisons, which is a group of scientists who determine whether it's the best fit for that institute or for somewhere else. So if you see it move from NIA to NCI, it's probably because NCI expressed more excitement about the application than NIA had. It's always something that you're welcome to ask about. So for those of you who want to request that an application be sent to NINR, and this would be true for most other ICs as well, it's important first to talk to a program officer. You'll hear me say this more times than you want, that you need to talk to a program early and often, because program officers can advocate for your application to be assigned to a particular institute. And contact information for program officers is available on websites for all of the institutes. Additionally, we strongly encourage you to fill out the PHS assignment request form. You can use this form to tell DRR and the scientific review officers what review groups you're most interested in and what institutes you're most interested in. You can list multiple institutes, make sure the one you're most interested in goes first. Having other institutes listed as dual can be helpful, because if for some reason we were at the end of a budget line, having another institute might allow for dual co-funding, or even for moving from one place to another. So the application review process at NINR looks much like it does for other institutes. The applications come in, their new renewal or resubmission. Each institute also has their own scientific review group. At NINR, our scientific review group reviews Fs, Ks, and Ts, and an occasional RFA for NINR. Everything else goes to CSR, and that's true for most institutes at this point. You'll get a summary statement. It gets reviewed by program. It goes to the advisory council, which makes recommendations. And the final decision is in the hands of the NINR leadership. And you'll either be funded or not awarded and go back into the line. So, as I said, extramural research awards can be funded in different places. CSR has most R01s, R21s, R15s also go to CSR, as do the small business applications. And some special initiatives, especially if they're trans NIH initiatives, are likely to go to CSR. Individual institutes and centers have different awards that they want to review in-house. For example, as I said, NINR does Fs, Ts, and Ks. Many other institutes have F, Ts, and Ks reviewed by CSR. So there will be some variation there. So this is something that I put up because many people have never looked or don't particularly care, but I was always curious about it. All of the numbers in your application number mean something. The first one tells us the application type, whether it's a new application, a renewal, a competitive renewal, a supplement, or the 5 would be a non-competing continuation for subsequent years. The next section is the activity code, and then the institute code, which is our 2 initial code. Then there's a serial number, and every institute has their own method of doing serial numbers. So one doesn't compare to the next. Some places it's just a numeric thing, others incorporate the year in it. It varies across NIH. The support year is the next 2-digit, and then the last 2-digit is only present if you have a resubmission, and that's that A1. This gives you an idea of the scoring system that's used at the Center for Scientific Review and at the institutes and centers. 1 to 9 scale with descriptors that correspond to each. And the descriptors are exceptional, outstanding, excellent, etc. Those are your 1, 2s, and 3s, right? So 1s are exceptional, 2s are outstanding, 3s are excellent. And when criterion are scored individually, these descriptors are often applied. So if a reviewer scored innovation as 2, it means that your project was outstanding in this area or highly innovative. On the other hand, when a score of 2 is given by a reviewer for overall impact, what they're saying is that it's highly likely that the project will exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research field involved and generally can be categorized as outstanding. So when you're looking, this is one of the first things as program officers we're looking for. When you get this summary statement, are the weaknesses things that are minor, that don't lessen the impact of the study, a moderate weakness, which may lessen the impact, or a major weakness, which severely limit the impact. Okay, the next important part is to know and understand the funding opportunities. So some of you have probably heard from program officers recently that we used to call funding opportunity announcements FOAs. We are now using the same language that's used across the rest of the federal agencies and talking about notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs, just so you know what our language is as it's changing. There are a number of different types of NOFOs. There are notices of special interest, or NOCs, which tell the public what we are interested in getting more research on. They point to other NOFOs, often the parent announcements, and you need to use both numbers if you're responding to a NOFO. NOIPs are notice of intent to publish, and these notices are used usually when there's a larger funding opportunity that is going to be open, and we want people to have the opportunity to start thinking about it and working on it before the actual NOFO is released. PAs are program announcements, and that includes the parent announcement, which are the investigator initiated. And PARs are program announcements with special receipt, review, or referral considerations. So they often have specific review criteria just for that PAR, and they often have non-responsive criteria. A PAS is a program announcement that has set aside funds, so you know in advance how much they're intending to spend on it. And RFAs are what most people really look for. Those are requests for applications, and RFAs, again, usually have set aside funds for a particular topic. And as I said, parent announcements are one type of program announcement. Okay, let's talk a bit about the grant proposal process. So in planning your NIH applications, there are a number of different approaches on how to do this. These are some basic first steps that can be useful. One is to explore what type of projects NIH is funding or has funded in your area of science. One way to do this is to look at NIH Reporter. This is an online database of NIH and VA funded projects, and you can explore what type of projects have been funded or currently are funded. You can filter it by an institute or center if you want to find which institutes have projects similar. You can even use their matchmaker and find a program officer who has a lot of similar studies in their portfolio. You can also use this to find collaborators because it will tell you who has been funded in those other areas. And it's a really useful resource as you're starting to plan a application. As I said, contacting a program officer early and often is always important. Email is usually best. Many of us don't answer our phones or are in a lot of meetings. We can answer emails in between, but it's much harder to get to phone calls. It helps if you send a 1 or 2 page concept document, or if you have a specific aim page. And we want to know what's the importance of the topic, how will it advance the field or improve clinical practice? What is the health outcome that you're looking at? What are the research questions and methods? What's the rationale for the approach? And what's the role of various members on the team? It helps if you come up with a few questions before you talk to a program officer. And that would depend a little bit on which institute or center you're going to be applying to. Obviously, I'm at NINR, so these are questions I would recommend for NINR. The first is whether or not your idea fits with the mission and the strategic plan of the particular institute. For example, at NINR, we have 5 research lenses, and we are very much looking to see if projects fit within those lenses. Another really good question is, which notice of funding opportunity should I be applying to? Another one is whether or not the research is considered a clinical trial, because that becomes critical later on in the application process. You can also ask how much funding you can request and what are the processes for requesting more, if that's possible. It is important to remember that when NIH program officers are giving you feedback, it is not a review. You have no obligation to follow the advice that they're giving you. They are giving you their best feedback, and they are not allowed to participate in developing or writing grant proposals. So many of you who have talked to me as a program officer know that if you ask me if you should do this study design or that study design, I'm not likely to give you an answer, but I may ask you a lot of questions about the two of them and why you would choose one over the other. Submitting the application. This is one of those critical places and very often doesn't get quite as much attention as it might need. The first thing is submit early and check everything. If you've submitted early, you may have the opportunity, if there are flags raised, to go back and change them. You have 48 hours after the application has gone in to make any corrections, as long as you submitted it prior to the end of the application period. So for example, if the end of the period is 5 p.m. on Friday of this week, if you submit it now, you can make corrections between now and Friday at 3:19 p.m. Eastern time. Until Friday afternoon, and you get warning flags. You only have until 5 p.m. Friday afternoon to fix them. So we talked a little bit about requesting primary and dual institutes. This is your opportunity to do that. It provides some flexibility if the institute that you said that you wanted isn't as interested, or if it's a particularly high program priority for a different institute. You can also request a study section. And I cannot emphasize this enough. If you are responding to a notice of special interest, you have to make sure that the NOC number is in box 4B of the application. I'm making a big point about this because there are a lot of NOCs for administrative supplements. If you do not include that number, it does not get reviewed for that particular funding available for administrative supplements. and it then just becomes an investigator-initiated administrative supplement application, which are not considered by some of the institutes and centers. So make sure your numbers are all on the page. We talked about this one. So one of the ways to figure out what study section would be best for you is to use the CSR assisted referral tool. This is a machine learning tool that looks at the words and the phrases and helps you find the best place for your particular application. I have a sample in here, and this is a sample that was generated from this site. You can see that both strong and possible review groups are listed. And you can see on the website that both the SRG column and the RB, which is review branch column, have hyperlinks. So you can go right to those pages and learn more about what that particular review group or review branch looks at. There's also a link to the most recent membership roster, so you can get an idea of who sits on which review group. This would be an example if you follow it to one of the review groups, and you get more information on the topics, on shared interest. The bottom will also give you some overlaps, which are some other study sections that you might want to take a look at. Okay, once you get your summary statement, you want to contact your program officer. Absolutely. It makes sense because we can go through your summary statement with you. We can help you determine if the goals of the application are achievable. So are the weaknesses fixable and minor, or are they more substantial and might require more significant change? We will not respond to the reviewers for you, but we certainly may offer you the opportunity to prepare a one-page response to the reviewers. That's something some institutes do and others do not. If there are human subjects or inclusion concerns at this point, you have the opportunity to respond to those and correct them. And perhaps most importantly, we can talk to you about next steps and what to expect depending on what the score was and how well your application fits the particular institute or center. So, as most of you know, NIH allows one resubmission of an unfunded application, and there's a 37-month window for resubmissions, so you have 3 years. So if something happens and you leave it by the wayside and come back a couple of years later, you might still be able to submit a resubmission. Resubmissions don't guarantee that it will go to the same study group, although they usually do go to the same institute or center. If you have submitted an O1A1 and not scored favorably to be funded, you can submit a new application on the same topic. It does not have to have a new title, but you can't refer to the previous applications at all. It comes in as a totally new application. So after the advisory council meeting, you really don't need to contact a program officer at this point. It's important to know that the only guarantee of funding is to receive that notice of grant award. After council, if more information is needed, the program officer or grants management specialist will contact you. There sometimes is a second just-in-time request. You may have earlier gotten one from NIH, which goes out to everyone with a score over or below 40. You may get a second just-in-time request at this point. It's not a guarantee of funding, but it is a request for additional information that's necessary for making final funding decisions. It's important to know that applications can be considered for funding for up to 1 year after the council date. So if you had an application from September of 2022 that scored well, it could still be funded, and it might be. For NINR, we do not have a published funding line, although we do have a published funding strategy. Some institutes like NIA do do publish a funding line. So do take a look at the particular institute that you're interested in. Okay, if your grant is funded, this is what we all want. Contact a program officer. Not all program officers do this, but I routinely set up a call with investigators to go through the notice of grant award together to make sure that we have the same understanding of the different statements in it. But we also want you to contact us at other times. You certainly will have to put in an annual research performance progress report, or RPPR. You need to contact us if there are any changes that you want to make that may change the human subjects or the scope of the award. If you're having challenges meeting your specific aims, we also want to hear from you. And we want to hear from you if you've got exciting publications or presentations or findings from the study. We can sometimes be in a position to help people know about the research that you've done. I also like to talk to people a little bit past halfway through the award to talk about next steps. So what are you doing next from this? Is there a competitive renewal that would be good? Are you looking at a new application? Are you looking at a different type of funding mechanisms? And anytime you've got questions, concerns, or comments, you're welcome to reach out to your program officer. Okay. I think I'm going to pause here for just a couple of minutes. Christine, do we have any questions that need addressing at this point?
I don't see any in the chat or in the Q&A yet. I'll keep on the lookout.
Then I will keep going. And if you do have questions, please do put them in. I'm happy to do my best to address them. This section is really important. There are some new policies that will affect all of you who are applying. So the first, as I said, NINR does publish our funding strategy. And this is our strategy for fiscal year 23. We are looking at scientific and technical merit, so your score. We're also looking at alignment with our strategic priorities, advancement of diverse perspectives, the availability of funds, and early stage investigators. At NINR right now, most of our competing R01 research project grants will be adjusted for a 4-year duration. There are some that will be granted at 5 years, but most will be adjusted down to 4. And if the application is requesting more than $350,000 in direct costs per year, there will likely be administrative budget reductions. That's pretty consistent with what happens across NIH. All of us are trying to make our budget stretch as far as possible so that we can fund as many meritorious applications as we can. So here's a couple of key notices. If you had not heard, Health and Human Services is terminating the COVID-19 public health emergency on May 11th. So starting on May 12th, NIH will no longer issue emergency notices of funding opportunities related to COVID-19. Ongoing emergency awards won't be impacted by this. It also means that some of the common rule exceptions to use of a single IRB will also no longer be accepted after May 11th. So we've talked about clinical trials, I think every time I've talked with investigators since 2015. Most of you are familiar with our clinical trial policies and our definition of a clinical trial, which is that it's a research study in which one or more human subjects are prospectively assigned to one or, and that may be to one or more arms, that there is an intervention, which is a manipulation of the subject or the subject's environment for the purpose of modifying one or more health-related biomedical or behavioral processes. The reason I'm bringing up clinical trials again is because the policy on what happens for misclassified clinical trials has not changed, but many people are not as familiar with it. So the 4 questions that we ask are, does the study involve human participants? Are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? Is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants? And is the effect being evaluated a health-related biomedical or behavioral outcome? If all the answers are yes, it's considered a trial. What's important to know now is that if the application says that a study is a clinical trial, but it is not, NIH is now allowing administrative adjustment prior to award. So if you say it's a clinical trial, it will be reviewed as a clinical trial. That's how the reviewers will consider it. But if we look at it and it's determined not to be a clinical trial, we can make an adjustment to that and it may be able to be awarded. However, if the application states that the project is not a clinical trial and it is determined to be a clinical trial, the application is withdrawn. Because when you say that something is not a clinical trial, there are sections of the application that don't populate. And we can't evaluate that, nor can the reviewers, if they do not have that information. So please do talk to your program officer. And I know I've talked with many of you that have projects that are not easy to classify. That's exactly why we're here, to help you figure out whether or not it is considered a clinical trial or not. Another big new thing is the data management and sharing policy, which is in effect for due dates on and after January 25th of this year to promote sharing of scientific data. A single sharing plan is now required for research for both genomic sharing data policy and the data management and sharing policy. And NIH program staff oversee reviewing and approving these plans prior to the award. These are some of the things that need to be included in it: the data type, the related tools and software, standards, data preservation, access and timelines, access and distribution and reuse considerations, and oversights of data management and sharing. This doesn't include everything. Things like laboratory notebooks, completed case report forms are not necessarily part of the data sharing policy. There is a sample of a data management and sharing plan that's available on the NIH website. We do recommend that these plans not exceed 2 pages in length. So taking a look at the sample is helpful so you know what are the key pieces that need to be available. This is included in the other plans section of the application. And this doesn't apply to all awards. So it does apply to research projects, R01s, R21s, R15s. It applies to certain career development awards, to SBIR, STTR awards, and to research centers. But it doesn't apply to training, fellowship, some conference grants, and some other awards. So please do check out the list. And the DMS plan assessment, investigators may request funds for data management and sharing costs in the budget and the budget justification sections of the application. Allowable costs include curating data, developing supportive documentation, sharing data through repositories, and local data management considerations. Unallowable costs are infrastructure costs, which should be included in indirect, and costs that are associated with the conduct of the research, which should be elsewhere in the budget. A couple of just kind of overarching ideas. One is where to share. We encourage sharing in established repositories. Institutes or centers may designate specific repositories that they want you to use, and INR does not have a designated repository at this point in time. You can also use a data type or discipline-specific repository if that's available to you. Some of these might be institutional repositories, PubMed Central, or generalist repositories. And there's some guidance on the website as well for helping choose a repository. You should plan on sharing your data as soon as possible, but no later than the time of an associated publication or the end of the award, whichever comes first. And this is just some resources that you can find at NIH. Final policy, the data sharing website, which has links to all of these resources, and information on the genomic program administrators, as well as FAQs on the new data management and sharing policies. Okay, this is the part I find fun. These are the tips that have been put together by myself and other program officers who have at least 5 years of experience across different ICs. And hopefully all of you will find at least one pearl in this. So the first is make sure you find the right NIH institute or center home for your application. As I said earlier, you can use the Matchmaker tool in NIH Reporter. You can look at NIH websites and get an idea from the descriptions that are there, the strategic plans, and some of the research examples of things that might be of interest to different institutes and centers. And also, please do use the NIH guide to identify relevant notices of funding opportunities. There are some wonderful ones out there at various points in time. The next is to contact a program official. Most program officials prefer to be contacted by email. And as I said before, if you share your specific aims or brief project description in advance, we can be much more helpful. I had someone ask me recently, well, can I just get on the call and talk to you about different research ideas and see if they fit? And the truth is you can, but I'm going to be of limited help because any particular idea might go many different directions as you develop it and start to operationalize how you'll do that study. And without looking at it a little further down the line, it's hard for me to tell you whether it's likely to be a good fit or not. We do encourage you, though, to contact us early in the application process, and you might want to talk to several program officers at different institutes before deciding where to submit. It can be really useful to find out who has a particular enthusiasm for your project. Read and understand the notice of funding opportunity. I cannot emphasize this enough. I have seen far too many applications that have come into RFAs that were disqualified because they missed something fairly simple. So the first thing is you want to confirm what ICs are participating. If you submit to an RFA that NINR is not participating in, and you ask for NINR, the application will still be accepted at NIH. It will be assigned to another institute, and that's fine, but it might not be what you were expecting. It's critical to look at eligibility and budget restrictions. If the RFA says that direct costs have to be $1 million or less, if you come in at $1,001, it may be withdrawn. So please do look at those carefully. Read the background section to understand the priorities behind the particular funding opportunity, and read the responsiveness criteria. Most PARs and RFAs now have responsiveness or non-responsiveness criteria. You also want to look at the application instructions and the review criteria to understand the requirements and expectations and what the reviewers will be considering. It's always helpful if you contact the scientific contact on a notice of funding opportunity if you have programmatic questions. There's also usually a grants management contact if you have budget or grants policy questions. Tip number 4, get feedback on your application draft. Do check in with the assigned program officer or scientific contact for feedback on your specific aims and on revised specific aims. And use your institutional resources for finding internal reviewers or setting up mock reviews. It's also important to check out resources from professional organizations for external review. However, When you are either working with organizations or using your professional network to find people to give you feedback prior to submission, do be mindful of whether or not they are on a study section that you might be interested in having review your application. If someone has pre-reviewed your application and they're on the study section, they may have to recuse themselves and they will not be allowed to use their expertise to look at your application in review, which is where it really counts. Double check the technical details. It's important to see if there are any last minute changes in the notice of funding opportunity or not. And as I said before, if you're responding to a NOC, make sure the NOC number is in box 4B. It's also important that if you are responding to an RFA, you have the correct RFA number in for the funding notice of funding opportunity. We've had a few applications that have gone astray that way, and it is likely to be reviewed where it was sent to, even if later in the application you say, no, we were applying for a different RFA. So make sure the correct number is listed, make sure that the MPI is correct, and please make sure that the most recent final version is being uploaded. As I said, you do have that 2 business day window that you can check on the application and make corrections if there are issues. What you have to do in that case is reject your application and then submit a corrected application. But if it's past 5 p.m. on the due date, even if it's within that 48 hours, it doesn't matter. You can't make changes. Submit early. Again, we just talked about why. It is important to know, though, if you can't view your submitted application, then NIH can't view it and can't review it. So if you can't, that's a time to get on the service desk hotline and find out what you need to do. You want to verify the numbers, you want to verify that the total budget is within limit and the clinical trial status. Address any of those warnings or errors, and it will make a big difference in the success of some of your applications. These are just contact information for my colleagues at NINR. We are always willing to talk to you about your research. And with that, I am done with my formal presentation, but I am more than happy to answer people's questions.
Thank you, Karen. We do have some questions, and those tips were awesome. Never tire of seeing those tips. Here's the first question, and it's from Elise, and it says, I'm not sure if this is program specific, but does having had a postdoc after your eligibility does having had a postdoc alter your eligibility for years of K funding? I haven't been able to find this answer online.
That's a great question. It depends on what your postdoc was and how it was funded. So if the postdoc was funded with an institutional K mechanism, like a K-12 or a KL2, it may limit the number of years that you're eligible for an independent K. If your postdoc was funded from another mechanism, it most likely does not affect your years of K eligibility, but I strongly encourage that you call a program officer to verify that. And some institutes and centers have a training director that all K questions go to. I will tell you right now at NINR, they're distributed by scientific question. So if you're interested in palliative and end-of-life care, I'm the one who you want to contact.
Awesome. Next question. If there are delays with the grant timeline due to institutional factors for our pre-PR this year, but you anticipate being able to meet the aims and goals in the upcoming years, is this something that you should be strategizing with your PO prior to the RPPR submission, or can it just be reported on the RPPR to the PO? Same question for justifying retention of budget. I anticipate using all funds as proposed in the coming year.
That's a great question. So if you are not proposing changes to the project, you might not need to contact a program officer. I'll tell you, I very much appreciate the relationships I have with my investigators. If it were me, I would say, yes, send me an email. We'll talk about it. That way, when the RPPR comes in, I know what's going on. Some program officers don't want to have as much communication. If you are planning on proposing any changes in the RPPR, so let's say that you're looking at, you had an N of 500 and you've already done analysis and seen that there's no way that you're likely to get 500, but that you are likely to be able to get 425 and you can meet your primary aims. A change like that should be discussed with your program officer prior to the RPPR. You can put it in the RPPR, and that does serve as a prior approval request. However, it's sometimes hard to get the information back and forth that might be needed. And if you talk to the program officer in advance, they can tell you all of the information they are going to want to be able to approve or not approve that request for a change. When it comes to retention of budget, if your award is a SNAP award, and most R01s and R21s are, the carryover will be automatic. If you're anticipating that you may have an unusually high carryover, it's worthwhile to talk to the program officer to alert them. And I will tell you, it is a common practice that if you have a very high carryover, you may have part of the funds restricted in the next year. It's not that they're being taken away, but rather that you have so much money that there is a concern in terms of stewardship if we would give you more until that amount is spent down. We typically tell people if funds are restricted that they should be contacting NIH approximately 2 to 3 months before they anticipate that they will use up those funds, so that we can approve release of those restricted funds. Probably way more information than was asked for.
Actually, that is incredibly helpful. And I do think that's really important for people to be aware of, that they need to be monitoring their budgets. If their budgets are going to be over the expected 25%, that they are actually communicating with their POs and giving them a heads up. So thank you for bringing that up, Karen. So this question, Elise, you may need to unmute to be able to explain it a little bit more, but I'll note it. Could you help distinguish between a clinical trial and a basic experimental study involving humans? I'm not sure I completely understand that question, but maybe Karen, if you do, you can answer it, or Elise, if you want to unmute, we can get more clarity on the question.
I can at least start with it. And Naomi, I'm going to put a link here that maybe you can send out to everybody. So BESH are basic experimental studies involving humans. And BESH studies meet the federal definition of basic research and the NIH definition of a clinical trial. So there is a website dedicated to BESH studies. BESH studies do meet the NIH definition of the clinical trial, but not all clinical trials are BESH. So if you have a study that is BESH, you need to make sure that you're responding to a funding opportunity announcement that allows that. Just like there are some that allow clinical trials, some require clinical trials, and some do not allow it. If a study or if a NOFO does not allow clinical trials, unless it states specifically that BESH are allowed, they would not be allowed. I will tell you, at NINR, we have very few BESH trials, so it's not something we work with a lot, but there are other institutes where there are quite a few of them. So most definitely, if you're proposing that, I would talk to the program officer for the particular funding announcement to make sure that you're applying in the right way.
Wow, I learned something myself about BESH trials. So thank you, Karen. So that actually is the last question, unless we have any more that have jumped up since. But I think mainly we got to thank you from Elise for your incredibly instructive answer. And unless we have any other questions, which I don't see any coming up, thanks for an amazing presentation, Karen, where you really gave us a lot of food for thought, lots of good tips, and always, per usual, help explain the alphabet soup of NIH acronyms, which we always appreciate. And this will really serve as incredibly good food for thought for those both watching this live now and those who are able to watch it in its recorded form. So thank you. And just also a special thanks to you for all that you have done for palliative care research, both through the Palliative Care Research Cooperative and all the rest of us who you've helped over the years.
I'm glad to be able to do so. And I think my last comment has to be, if you're thinking about putting in an application, please do call me or one of my colleagues across NIH. We're here to talk to you and we want to help make the process easier.
And I will say that Dr. Kehl is one of the most responsive POs that I know. So take her up on her offer. And many thanks, and I'll turn it over to Naomi.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kehl and Christine. Just a couple things to wrap up. We'll see you next month on May 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And we'll have Dr. Rebecca Aslakson speak on lessons learned from her studies in palliative care in the ICU. So registration will be open shortly for that. And as always, please do complete our post survey so we can continue to improve our IDC offerings. So thanks so much for attending, everyone, and take good care.